The room is still filling up, approaching 130 participants. A lot of interest for this new database on informality and social protection. All right, I think we can start. Thank you very much for attending this webinar on this new OECD database on informality and social protection. You'll hear the little name and acronym of KIIbIH a lot this afternoon, and our colleagues are going to walk you through what all these letters mean. I'm Henri-Bernard, Solignac-Lecomte. I work in communications for development at the OECD, and I'll be your host for the next hour and a half. And I'm very happy to introduce to you the incredible panel that was assembled to walk us through this new tool. We will have a quick introduction by Alexandre Kolev, who's the head of the Social Cohesion Unit at the OECD Development Center, and as such overseeing this project. Justina, who's been doing all the work, frankly, at the OECD Development Center, will show you how it works and what new data it makes available. And then we'll break it down thanks to a panel of very distinguished speakers. First, Rodrigo Negrete, who's a researcher at INEGI, which is the National Institute of Statistics and Geography of Mexico. Then we'll have Florence Bonnet, who's an economy specialist, labor market and informal economy specialist at the ILO. Then Francoise Carre, the director of the statistics program and research coordinator at WIEGO. And Edgar Vielma, also working in INEGI, but this time is the Director General of Socio-Demographic Statistics. And finally, Johannes Jutting, who is the Executive Head of the Partnership in Statistics for Development in the 21st Century, which a lot of you, I'm sure, know as Paris 21. Once we'll have some quick reactions to the database by these panelists, we will open the discussion to you. And so very simply, the way you can ask questions is through the Q&A function of your Zoom screen. And I would kindly ask you, and I'll remind you of that closer to the time, when you ask a question to kindly say who you are, who's posing the question, and who you want to ask it to. Could be one or several members on the panel, or it could be just complimentary remarks. You may also interact with all participants through the chat function. That's it for now. Alex, you're the head of the Social Cohesion Unit of the OECD Development Center. Can you tell us what we're here to discover?
Thank you, Henri-Bernard, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone. It's really a great pleasure for me to welcome you to this webinar, which is co-organized with socialprotection.org for the launch of this new OECD dataset on the key indicators of informality based on individuals and their household, the so-called KIIbIH. So let me maybe just recall that this new data set is the outcome of a lot of research and analysis on informality that was initially undertaken by the OECD Development Center with the support from the European Commission under the EU Social Protection System project, and that is now being graciously supported by SIDA. So the development of the KIIbIH has also involved a number of collaboration, in particular with the ILO and the DIAL Research Center, and we like also to thank them for their contributions. So the KIIbIH dataset is packaged for the public, for all of us, and will be accessible on OECD.stat. It remains a living database that will be updated frequently throughout the year, and using relevant data set that becomes available. So the idea is very much to continue updating the KIIbIH and improving the data set. Let me also stress that the KIIbIH complements existing ILO data on informality by portraying informality both at the individual and the household level. And as such, the data set is able to provide deeper insight on the vulnerabilities of informal workers in the context of their households, taking into account not only the employment status of informal economy workers, but also households' socio-demographic and economic status. So this, we hope, will allow policymakers and researchers and data users that will actually use the KIIbIH to have an overview of workers in the informal economy, to assess how such vulnerabilities may be passed on to their dependents or inversely be mitigated by other household members, and ultimately to help identify social protection interventions that fit the needs of informal workers, taking into account the context of their household. So we warmly invite you to provide any comments or suggestions that you might have. And now I will pass the floor to Justina, who will present the database. So welcome to everyone again.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. In this presentation, I will discuss the main indicators of our new OECD database on informal employment and how we can expect to use it to improve policymaking on informal economy workers with regard to social protection extension strategies. So by the end, we hope that you'll have your own ideas about how you can use this database in your work and ideas for us on how to improve the database. Okay, so we'll start with a short description of the structure before getting into the main indicators that are currently available and potential uses in a policymaking context, and close out with a quick walkthrough for accessing the dataset on OECD Stat. So once again, the aim of this database is to provide national policymakers and researchers with more data on the risks and the vulnerabilities of informal workers and their household dependents. By covering households as well as individuals, the database allows for a greater understanding of informality, how it affects just more than informal workers, and also to open a conversation about how social protection can be extended in innovative ways to reduce the vulnerability of those affected by it. So the KIIbIH provides this harmonized data calculated using the ILO definition of informal employment based on household surveys with comprehensive labor force modules. We have an average of 2 points in time for some countries, and will continually work to expand upon the time series dimension. We use panel data where we can, which allows us to track transitions in and out of informal employment, but also poverty. Currently, we cover 42 OECD and non-OECD countries across Africa, Asia, the Americas, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia. So if we move to the next slide, we can see the current list of the countries included. The countries displayed in purple are our panel countries. Okay, so if we move to the next slide, we can talk about what are the main indicators that we currently provide. The basic indicators that are provided at the individual level are disaggregated by gender, level of education, age, location of residence. And one of the new main indicators that we offer in the KIIbIH is what we call the degree or the level of household informality. So in this indicator, we categorize households according to whether their workers are entirely employed in informal jobs, formal jobs, or both. And consequently, we call them informal, formal, and mixed households. We provide this information disaggregated by location and the types of household dependents that they have. So now I'm going to briefly discuss what this data looks like and potential policy applications for a random set of countries in the KIIbIH before moving on to the next set of main indicators. So one of the questions that we can try to answer with the KIIbIH is how many people does informal employment touch or affect? So using this data, this graph shows the distribution of the total population by household type. Individuals living in households represented by the dark blue bars live in informal households, the gray in mixed and the light blue informal households. But what does this mean? So many informal workers are precariously employed and do not enjoy any social protection or employment benefits. And this can be a major source of concern for themselves and their economic dependents in case of shocks to their income or massive shocks like the COVID-19 crisis. So as you can see, the majority of the general population live in households where all workers are informally employed. And here we can see to what extent the general population is potentially vulnerable to the risks borne by the workers in their households, whether living in an informal or a mixed household. Another question that we can ask is, what is the extent, if we move to the next slide, sorry. Another question that we can ask is, what is the extent of the risk of income shocks to informal workers? So using the indicator on informal workers by household type, we can observe the share of informal workers that live in either mixed households or informal households. So as risk pooling institutions, workers living in entirely informal households are even more vulnerable due to their collective lack of social protection, as compared to households with formal members, where at least one person would benefit from the social safety net in case of shocks to income. Next slide, please. So thirdly, we can ask what other groups are affected by informal employment. Here, we can see the distribution of child dependence under age 5 by household type. And what we can see is that the majority of children under 5 live in households that are supported only by informal workers. So due to their economic dependence on adults, these children find themselves at higher risk than children living in formal households, who are indirect beneficiaries of the social protection enjoyed by their parents or other adult providers. We might imagine that universal child benefits could go a long way in reducing the income vulnerability of informal households with children. Next slide, please. So let's move on to some other indicators offered in KIIbIH. At the household and the individual level, we provide some measures of welfare and social protection coverage. So income or consumption are used to measure welfare, and where they are properly identified, we include information on the coverage of social assistance programs and social insurance programs, as well as a new indicator that we call the capacity to contribute based on food security, which I'll discuss in an upcoming slide. Next slide, please. So with this set of indicators, we can ask how many informal workers stand to benefit from social assistance. Here we can see the poverty status of workers by informal activity. Informal workers have a much higher probability of being poor by the 320 a day line as compared to formal workers. This indicator would allow national policymakers to monitor the share of informal workers who are poor, and we could imagine that anti-poverty programs like cash transfers that target the poor would greatly reduce the income vulnerability of a great share of informal workers. Next slide, please. So another question that we can attempt to answer is to see how many informal workers could potentially afford to contribute to tailored social insurance schemes. So this new indicator that I was speaking about on food security provides an estimate on the number of workers who are non-poor and whose households spend less than half of their income on food, which potentially allows them to contribute towards their own social insurance plans without going into material deprivation. So again, this information could potentially help national policymakers design contributory schemes in a way that would be tailored for those informal workers with this capacity to contribute. Next slide, please. Thank you. So now that you've seen a little bit of what we have to offer, I'd like to show you where you can find it and other tools to engage with us on the subject. We have a web page dedicated to the KIIbIH database, which you will be seeing shortly. Sorry, technical difficulties. Sorry about that. So we have a web page dedicated to the KIIbIH database where you will be able to easily find the access link, read a list of our past and forthcoming analyses using the database, and contribute your own. So if you publish any articles or papers using our data, please let us know, and we'll be happy to put it up on the website for others to access as well. So here we can see the database in OECD Stat. You'll find it in the development theme under the informal economy subtheme. And we currently allow you to browse the 29 indicators that were originally published with the Tackling Vulnerability in the Informal Economy report released in 2019, which have since then been updated with new data for the additional countries that we have been working on. And once again, we're offering this database as a public good in the hopes that you as policymakers and researchers will be able to use the KIIbIH in your work and benefit from what we hope will be a knowledge sharing platform. So we're looking forward to any feedback that you may have during the Q&A part of the webinar, and your input is key to ensuring that this tool can be as useful as possible. So that's it from me, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Justina, for this brief introduction to the KIIbIH. So now we know what the acronym stands for, and we get a bit of an idea of what's in there and how this can help researchers and policymakers complement the databases they traditionally have access to with more information, particularly on the household dimension and the connections for informal workers. So we want to use this opportunity, this webinar, to get to know better the database. It's an opportunity to ask questions, make suggestions also, and of course, turning to our panelists to share their experience of seeking and using data for the sake of informing social protection policies in particular. And so I'm now turning to you, Rodrigo. You're a researcher at the National Institute of Statistics and Geography of Mexico. And tell us in 5 to 7 minutes what your first reactions are to this addition to the toolbox of statisticians working on the informal economy.
Well, thank you, Henri-Bernard. I have a general comment before going that. And well, hi, everyone. Here in the center of Mexico, it's early in the morning on what seems to be a very hot, dry day. First of all, I appreciate the importance of this event. So thank you to OECD Development Center, as well as the International Policy of Inclusive Growth, and all those behind this huge effort to harmonize data of so different countries worldwide with so different languages and styles or schools, if you will, in documenting data and metadata. Not a small feat at all, consider that the subject always has been conceptually complex and multi-layered. As we all know, the statistical story of informality has been quite long since its inception back in 1972 in that legendary report of an ILO mission to Kenya. The ancient discussion lasts 20 years long because the many theoretical approach trying to tie up the concept of what each frame single out as the main cause of the phenomena, so compromising a pragmatic description to serve better this or that explanation. In 1993, ILO achieved a key synthesis in linking the notion of informal sector to the concept of unincorporated enterprises of the household sector, thus establishing a bridge of understanding with the wider frame of the system of national accounts. However, what the concept gained in terms of precision and clarity lost in scope, leaving out many other modalities of not protected jobs, difficult to understand in terms of unincorporated enterprises. Thus, in 2003, ILO, by means of the 17 ICLS, added up another dimension, this time not centering the characteristic of the economic unit, but on jobs. In this way, ILO expanded the concept of informality beyond the informal sector, so to include subsistence agriculture, paid domestic workers, and not less important, non-protected jobs directly employed or engaged in processes of the formal sector. Inclusions means heterogeneity. After 2003, informality now encompasses informal sector and other traditional modes of labor insertion, as well new forms of informality linked with wider forms of labor flexibilization that national legislations either do not detect or not even conceptualize. The best way to deal with this composite of situations so far is by means of what we know as the Huysmans matrix. That classification mechanism of jobs that in its rows consists on type of economic units, informal sector, other traditional ones, and formal sector, and in columns, status in employment categories. This device, in terms of the inner composition of informality in the case of Mexico, shows that more than half of the informality cannot be explained alone by the informal sector. Moreover, the demographics of the informal sector and the one of the informal jobs engaged in formal economic units is quite different. Not less their industry distributions and other characteristics. Moreover, within the ILO working group on informality indicators led by our colleague Florence Bonnet, there is a growing understanding that in terms of policy making, what is needed or makes sense for the informal sector not necessarily fits well with other forms of informal jobs. In one hand, there are extreme forms of informality for which rushing them into formalization is not a realistic goal. In the other, modalities in the threshold of formalization or closer to that possibility. To say that something needs more conceptual granularity is always annoying, but this time it is unavoidable to point out we should take care in conveying data on informality as if it were one single block. In certain set of countries, most informality belongs to the traditional form of it. In others, the phenomenon, it is almost split by half as in the case of Mexico. And finally, in other countries, the new forms of informality might be the dominant ones in their landscapes. We should be aware that we may have in the same table informality composites depending of the region of the world and country quite different. As I see, the stronger set of this data set, this database, is when the household is the unit of observation and forms with poverty measures. No doubt, vulnerability only can be fully grasped at the level of the household, which allows us to understand deeply the survival strategies where marginal and not marginal ways of labor market insertion are combined. In this token, I might suggest adding up a classification of type of household, single out those led by women without a couple support. The link to poverty might create an incentive to choose as a source of income, an income expenditure survey over a labor force one in those countries where exists both. This is a trade-off, of course, because a labor force survey is better suited to characterize jobs as well labor conditions and their linkage to different types of economic units. That is why I think this huge effort of harmonization made by OECD does not replace but join ILO efforts to conduct countries toward the 21 ICLS in 2023, so to produce and disseminate better indicators on informality, exploiting LFS strengths. On regarding formality issues, LFS are better suited when the unit of observation are persons, when vulnerability dimensions can be added based on jobs. ILO looks forward to upgrade the descriptions so far available on informality at the national level, highlighting data meaningless meaning in assessing progress or the opposite, and then set up a common international language so to monitor each national performing. Florence Bonnet surely will explain all this better than me, as well all the dimensions involved in the ILO approach.
And she might actually very soon introduce them, if I can prompt you to closing your remarks.
Okay.
Rodrigo.
And well, I leave my comment here now, not without praising again OECD for taking this effort and this bold step scaffolding the use of informality data to new heights. So thank you very much, and congrats again.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo, and thank you for being with us, because I know you're hard pressed, with a number of things to do today. We heard already some proposals to further differentiate between different types of households and more collaborative work to be done with the ILLO. Speaking of which, Florence, Rodrigo just mentioned your work, on the fact that the informal sector is actually many, many, many different things. Now, let me turn to you to get your first reaction to this database, what it does, what it doesn't, and what your hopes are for its future.
Many thanks. And I should say it's not my work, it's really common work. But yeah, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And many thanks for the invitation to participate in this webinar. I will have 4 main points with possibly some overlaps with intervention from Rodrigo, but we try to avoid too many. So my first point is mainly to highlight the positive contribution of the KIIbIH database and approach. The approach which takes into consideration both the individual and the household dimension in terms of informality, but also vulnerabilities, contributes not only to enhance the understanding of the situation of workers and informal economy in the informal economy, but also of workers within households and beyond workers of peoples depending on the informal economy. That means elderly, by elders and children, notably. But beyond that, it's not only about describing and understanding multiple realities, and here I insist on realities. This is also about identifying groups of workers, of people that call for different policy responses, depending on this broader assessment of vulnerabilities, but also opportunities within the household, in addition to the assessment we used to do on personal and job-related features and vulnerabilities at the individual level. So it's clear that including the household dimension allows not only to assess poverty, but also to identify in a more comprehensive manner the type of protection workers and people have access to, social protection, assets, and more generally intra-household security and insecurity. It brings clearly for some directions regarding realistic modalities to extend social protection, contributory versus non-contributory, depending on the capacity to contribute, but also many other factors that have to be taken into account. And more globally, it considers risk and factors beyond the world of work, beyond even the reduction of decent work deficit, which are also of importance together with other factors when it comes to address vulnerabilities in the informal economy, which is for many a necessary and preliminary step before we can move to formality and make it possible. Now I'm moving to the second point, which was already tackled or highlighted by Rodrigo, is that this combined approach, looking at individuals as workers and individuals as part of households, will be part of the framework of indicators that is currently under development in the context of the revision of international statistical standard on informality. And this will be discussed and hopefully adopted in 2023. And several of you actually are actively part of this working group. The main objective of the framework of indicators is really to guide countries, NSOs, on how to use data on informality to produce, interpret, but also combine indicators, first to describe and get a better understanding of the multiple realities of workers, but also economic units in the informal economy. That means going beyond the dichotomy formal-informal. But it's also then to support the development of policies and interventions to reduce vulnerabilities, reduce decent work deficit, and support gradually this complex process of formalization. This second point might be a little long, but just let me say a few words about the framework to highlight some of the dimensions we consider important. Some of them include the indicators in the KIIbIH, and there are also other dimensions. So the indicators proposed as part of the framework are organized around 3 different units of observation. It's about jobs and persons, but it's also about economic units. And here I would like to add a word, economic units, it's important because we know that more than 85% of all workers in informal employment are in the informal sector. And here, that means that it calls for measures to improve productivity, to improve the situation of the place of work, to develop the conditions and ability, but also willingness for those units to be not only sustainable, but also in a position to provide decent work. So saying again, like Rodrigo was saying, that it's important also to include this issue of the type of production unit. And then the third unit of reference are national accounts, considering the contribution of the informal economy to the national economy. Alors, this is about units of observation. Now coming to the dimensions that we cover, there are 5 dimensions that go through the different units of observation. First, the extent of informality in terms of jobs, units, and contribution to the economy. Second, the structure of informality at the individual level. And here, this includes an important first step, which is to map workers according to 2 important characteristics. And here I'm referring to the Usman matrix that was mentioned by Rodrigo. So that means that it would be, and it is really important, to look at stages in employment, employees, independent workers, contributing family workers, and dependent contractors, for whom, by definition, formality and informalization, at least understood in a very strict sense, have a different meaning and refer to different policy responses or combination of policies. And then the type of production unit, again, informal sector, formal sector, and households. And again, it's really important to acknowledge that all those in the informal sector would need, as a first step, the formalization of units. So ideally, most of the indicators should be not only disaggregated by sex, but also by status in employment and type of production unit. Then still about the structure of informality, this is also about identifying workers most exposed to informality, but also most represented in the informal economy by main socio-demographic features. And here we go with what we can see in the KIIbIH, age, education, sex, of course, obviously that should be considered throughout, place, geographical area. But then also importantly, and I didn't see much in the presentation about the KIIbIH, about economic characteristics. So that means the most important ones would be, again, status in employment, sectors, that was also pointed out by Rodrigo, but also the size of enterprises and place of work. Now I move to the third dimension, and I hope I don't lose you. The third dimension is about working condition, exposure to decent work deficit, and job-related vulnerabilities. And here are the strengths of labor force survey. This concerns the informal economy, but also the formal economy, to assess whether formality also is associated to real protection, and to assess if formalization means access to protection. The type of issues covered here include labor income security, organization and representation of workers, working time, job-related social security, skills security, employment security. And for enterprises, it includes productivity and the analysis of factors that enhance or constrain the survival and development of productive units that would be in a position to provide decent work. Some of those dimensions are complemented by the fourth dimension, which is about contextual vulnerabilities. And the household dimension is part of it. Actually, it's the main component. So this contextualization of contextual vulnerabilities include, yes, the household dimension, so level of informality within households, composition of households, income security at the household level, looking at all sources of income, but also expenditure, and obviously social protection, considering both non-contributory and contributory benefits, individual, but also household-based benefits. Another component within this contextual vulnerabilities.
And maybe the last one.
Yeah, I still have found something to say after. Is the legal and regulatory framework. And here, I know that it's not part of KIIbIH, but the main purpose is to identify the source of informality between a lack of legal coverage, identification of workers excluded from the scope of laws, and this is something to take on board, and the lack of implementation. And finally, the fifth dimension is about other drivers as part of the macroeconomic context. Can I continue for at least 1 or 2 minutes?
Make it one.
Okay, so the idea is really based on those indicators, first to describe, decompose informal and formal employment, but also to be in a position to answer to questions like from what type of levels of protection do workers in the informal economy benefit, both at the individual and household level, based on the assessment of levels of formality and levels of vulnerability at the individual and household level, make the distinction between those that are ready to formalize compared to others that are more in the most vulnerable segment of the informal economy, or whether formal jobs means adequate protection. And just to come to my third point, and I will forget about my fourth one, this is about the important distinction between formalization in the narrow understanding and the broader understanding of it, and more importantly, the process of formalization. And here I would like to recall that formalization should be considered as a mean rather than an objective. And this is important to reiterate here, the need to focus on people and their effective access to protection, which is also part of KIIbIH. And second, as mentioned before, it's important to recognize that not all workers and units are ready to formalize now, and that sustainable formalization associated to real protection and the capacity to take full benefit of it is really a long-term process, and that for many, this involves important preliminary steps and conditions to be met. There is obviously a continuum of situations between workers and economic units in terms of levels of formality, but also levels of vulnerabilities, and also in terms of conditions to be met to be able to access to protection. And just to say about the conditions to be met, one can mention, for instance, the fact to be, again, in informal employment in the informal sector, requiring the formalization of enterprises, the fact to be excluded from the scope of laws, that call first for the extension of laws and regulation, to be able then to tackle or address implementation issues. And this is broadly about addressing decent work deficit and even beyond, progressively reduce vulnerabilities and increase the capacity of workers and enterprises to enter in the formal economy. So, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, my first point was also to point out to the different sources used and weaknesses and strengths also associated to them, household income and expenditure survey versus labor cost survey. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Florence. And again, this is just the beginning of a conversation, and we'll have other opportunities, of course, to continue to discuss the pros and cons and the ways we can make the most of this database. Thank you also for pointing us to the policy aspects in very concrete terms of what that are entailed in this work. I'd now like to turn to Francoise Carre, who you're the director of the Statistics Program and Research Coordinator at WIEGO, which is Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing. Just before that, remind everyone that you're welcome to start asking your questions in the Q&A. We'll take them up after our panelists. Francoise, the floor is yours. Although you seem a bit frozen.
Thank you, Henri-Bernard, and hello, everybody. And okay, let me know if I should shut off my camera. I'm going to start, and let me know if I should turn off my video. I'm very glad to be here, and thank you for hosting these meetings. And thank you for providing the full name of WIEGO. I just want to say a couple of words about it. WIEGO is a global research and policy network on informal employment. We focus on informal work and workers, and especially women in the informal economy. We foster the activities of member-based organizations of informal workers, notably the formation of global networks of regional and national organizations. The statistics program of WIEGO aims at the improvement of the measurement of informal employment and unofficial statistics, and in fostering international harmonization and use of these statistics. Our second objective is to foster the accessibility and the use of statistics for policy design and policy advocacy. So the perspective we bring is very much that of users of statistics. In the interest of time, I'm going to spend a very little time on the strength of the database, because I want to say that I concur with the comments that Rodrigo, Negrete, and Florence Bonnet have just made. What I will just say is that we much appreciate that the database draws attention to the prevailing form of employment in much of the world. Today, the emphasis is on social protection, but the informal workforce also lacks labor rights, and their businesses, their economic units, as Florence mentioned and called attention to, their economic units are rarely the subject of economic development policies. or urban development policy. So I commend you on the bridging and the linking and embedding as best as possible workers, informal workers in their household. And I guess what I would say about the strengths of that approach is that it identifies the characteristics of the households of informal workers that may mitigate or accentuate the impacts of some of the vulnerabilities that come from informal employment. And so calling attention to this and illustrating it and measuring it is a welcome thing to do. I would also add that the possibility of building time series and making those available is also very useful. So I'm not spending much time on this simply because of the constraints on time. What I want to say also is that how the WIEGO perspective on the use of indicators is that we find the cross-national comparisons and having harmonized measures of informal employment quite useful to enhance the visibility of informal employment and to support arguments in global venues and national values for policy attention to be directed to the needs of informal workers. At the country level, we use those types of statistics to support the activities of member-based organizations, of allies and other civil society organizations to increase the visibility of informal workers, to highlight their contribution to employment, and to highlight salient issues. And you know, at of the measures on the households of informal workers, those we're quite interested in are those on the share of households that are at greater risk of poverty, as well as those that are in poverty. I was asked to think a bit about what other kinds of statistics are needed of informality, so that's what I'm going to talk about right now. One of the key focuses of WIEGO, and this has also been underscored by Rodrigo, Negrete, and Florence Bonnet, is that informal employment is stratified by status in employment, by type of work, by sex, and other dimension. And the assessment of needs and the policy approaches have to take these disparities into account. So one of the things we do in our statistics work is to focus on worker groups. And what we mean by worker groups is sort of the main types of informal work we see around the world. And these are sort of subsets of industry and occupations. The four main groups we focus on are home-based workers, street vendors and market traders, domestic workers, and waste pickers. And each of these groups faces a specific set of economic conditions, of constraints, and of relevant regulations and area of policy. The second dimension that matters a great deal, and Florence also noted this, is place of work. Working in a public space, or working at home or in a structure near to your home, or working in someone else's home, all have implications for how the work happens. And the workplace also tends to drive the types of policies that are going to matter in addition to social protection. For street vendors, it's urban policies, regulation on use of public space. For home-based workers, and actually for street vendors too in different ways, it's infrastructure policies and the right to housing. For waste pickers, it's public policies on contracting and public services. And for domestic workers, it can range as broadly as health and safety and migrant rights. When we consider the household dimension for informal workers, knowing that work is happening at home or near home is bound to have impacts on dependence. So what we see is that we know that the ICSE 18, the classification of status and employment, as that gets implemented, the place of work will be a key variable. And so it'll be easier for countries to report this and for it to be reported in international databases. Third, there's another major divide in informal employment, which is not a surprise to anybody, is the division between agricultural work and non-agriculture. And we understand that it's quite hard for countries, or at least there are issues around measuring informal employment in agriculture. What we do in some of our own work at the national level with national statisticians is we've been able to measure informal employment in agriculture, particularly home-based work in agriculture. But I mentioned this now, even though I understand it's difficult, simply for planning for the future.
Françoise, can we
Fifth and last,
try and wrap up? Very good.
Yes, last. Fifth point, I'd like to see, we would like to see high-income countries included in this database. And that will require countries being more explicitly measuring informal employment. They have lots of ways to measure the dimensions and the indicators or the markers of informal employment, but to actually report it. And particularly informal employment in formal sector firms and informal employment that is generated by the contracting practices of formal sector firms. The ILO harmonized estimates released in 2018 were already including quite a number of high-income countries, and it would be, I would encourage this database to do so as well. And could start with Western Europe, because I think that might be one of the regions where it's possible. So in conclusion, I simply want to say that having key dimensions for informal workers at the national level and cross-nationally, and having these additional dimensions will be very useful and providing important complementarity to what the ILO is also doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Françoise. Thank you, and we count on your continued input on this product, of course. You are putting your questions in the Q&A. Keep them coming. That's really good, and we will try to do justice to them all in either orally or in writing afterwards. Let me now turn to Edgar. Vielma Orozco, you're the Director General of Socio-Demographic Statistics at the National Institute of Statistics and Geography of Mexico. The floor is yours, Edgar, for 5 to 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Bernard. It's a pleasure to be here and to share the experience of Mexico in these topics, and also celebrating the effort of the OECD to develop this big database related to key indicators of informality based on individual and their household. I believe this is very important to show to the world, and that everybody know the context of the countries in these specific topics. And for us also is very important because in a specific case like Mexico, and as already Rodrigo said, more than 56% of people are in this condition in the case of Mexico. So this is why for us it's very important, and maybe many countries that are now participating or watching this webinar are also understanding the importance of this effort. And also, in the case of Mexico, given that for us this is very important, we are developing new techniques, not only to have this information to national level or to a state level that, for example, now let us to produce this information with the actually survey that we have. And that we can produce this information to this kind of geographical level. Also, we are working in produce this information at the principal 39 cities of Mexico that are concentrating this kind of phenomenon, but also through techniques of a small area. We have developed indicator at municipal level. It means for the 2,455 municipal in Mexico, now we have a indicator about informal, the informal sector indicator for this level. It means we needed not only to focus in the general situation, but to focus in the most specific indicators of this area. This effort, or to achieve this effort, we combined the census and the administrative record of national authorities related to the formal workers. And through these mathematical techniques, we developed this kind of indicator. Not only this, in the last years and with the COVID-19, in the case of Mexico, was very important to measure this phenomenon, because in the case of Mexico, 12 million of people lost their jobs, and from them 10 million were in the informal sector. It means the principal subject that suffer the crisis in the world are the people in the informal sector. But we didn't know this kind of information if we don't develop a new product like we did it in the case of the pandemic. The Ministry of Health asked to suspend the face-to-face interviews, and we changed to another techniques to collect information, and we continue to producing the information in spite of this kind of restriction, and we never stopped to produce information, not only at national level. That was the first step or the first strategy to produce this information with a new technique that we developed through the pandemic situation. But also after that, we collect this information again. We implement the techniques of a small area estimation to disaggregate this information, in this case to a state level. So the work that we are doing in order to supply information through these last years is to use any kind of information that can show the impact of not only a pandemic situation, but any kind of crisis that needed to follow this kind of indicator. And if you are doing this kind of effort to visualize the information, to collect the information, and to disseminate in all the countries these indicators, I think we are in the same path, and we want to zoom the effort with the OECD, providing this kind of information and standardizing the indicator that we are constructing in all the countries. So thank you very much, Bernard, for this effort, and believe that Mexico will be in this work in order to be a better view of this work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edgar, for sharing your experience from the Institute and for your offer to continue to work with us. We really count on you as with on all the panelists here. Johannes, of course, you're also very interested in the issue of how data not only is produced, but how it's used, because that's the double approach that you have in Paris 21. Can you tell us, and your final panelists before we go into the Q&A, what your first reactions are to the launching of this new database?
Well, thank you very much, Henri-Bernard, and good morning, good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be taking part in this panel. And as the last speaker, if I may, I will step a little bit back on the very interesting discussion we just had. And I want to maybe make 3 points, if you don't mind. The first would be just to say a few words about the topic and the timeliness of the topic for today's discussion, hopefully soon post-pandemic, or as we move out. Second, I wanted to say also the contribution the database can make to the SDG conversation, leave no one behind, and disaggregated data. And last but not least, very quickly, but quite important, is to pick up some of the points you just raised in terms of data use policies and how we can turn better data into better policies for better lives. And all this in 5 to 7 minutes, Henri-Bernard, you will be amazed. So very quickly, on the first point, I think it's very timely. I want to really congratulate the whole team at the Development Center with the colleagues of socialprotection.org to put this topic of informality and vulnerability on the table of policymakers right now. It's now the time to talk about it. It's now the time to make it visible, the topic itself. I was just looking, the Development Center has a long track record over 30 years of research on informality. The last publication I was also involved some 10 years ago, Informal is Normal. If you see the whole strand of conversation, it's still very normal, and it's even now reaching out to OECD countries. And this is sort of tangentially, I think it would be good to, if we talk about this topic, to make the link to the conversation that we have in terms of protecting the self-employed in the gig economy and the platform economy. And how do we think about, informality is even spreading out further, and how can we learn from each other, from situations in very poor countries and to situations in richer countries where we have also quite poor pockets. So really great to have this this conversation. And let me just put one additional policy. I think universal basic income protection. I mean, we talk about informality, social protection, but where's the link to universal basic income conversation? So I think let's think a little bit further. Just don't stay always in our sectorial mind, but let's think big, ambitious. I think the pandemic was big, so we need to think about big policy responses as well. That's the first point. A second, very quickly, I think the colleagues would be well advised. I think you did a great job. Makes the link to the SDGs, leave no one behind, disaggregated data. I think this database can be jumbled up with other data. You can move into the whole conversation about gender data. There's so many conversations now going on women's economic empowerment, on the contribution of women, showing this database and jumbling up with other databases. I think we can get interesting information, interesting new insights, which then also will help to understand the role, in particular, of women for family business, for taking care of elderly, for health care, and for many other things, which will help us hopefully to devise some policies that both have a protection side, but also empower people, here in this case specifically women. And let me just move to the third and last point, and maybe spend just 1 minute more on that one, because I think it's really critical, and many of you have said it. And also let me put on a little bit my sort of hat as the Paris 21, working for Paris 21. So it's very good to have this database, by all means, lovely, and comparative analysis, all good. But it has been said, we also need to go hand in hand to help countries to set up those databases, to support countries to set up data for their national policy making. These data, what you have here, is good for international comparative analysis, and there are wonderful lessons to be learned. But those need to be complemented with lessons for countries. We need to have actionable data at the country level. In Rwanda, in Malawi, in Vanuatu, in Costa Rica, we need to have those data, and we need your support to strengthen national statistical offices to produce those data. And we also need more funds for this. So we need to go hand in hand to lobby more for funding for foundational data system. In reality, it's not only a question of data on specific informal employment, as complicated as it all is, and social protection. We need to strengthen the whole statistical systems in developing countries. And we need more and better funding for this. So hopefully we can join forces to make a strong plea through the OECD and through the ILO for asking for more and better funding. And let me conclude, Henri-Bernard, to stay into the 7 minutes, is the point that I think also a few colleagues have made: data use and traction. In reality, I mean, we all say these databases are for policymakers and researchers, but I haven't seen yet a policymaker going to a database, doing the analysis, and then drafting a wonderful policy, right? It's not happening. So what I would like to see from you guys is show me how we turn those better data into better policies that change lives. We need to, if I can make the call for more better investments, policymakers will be asking, how do you show that data really matters? With the pandemics, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, everybody loves data now. On the other hand, everybody says, yeah, we are confused. The data is not there, it's not timely, it's not granular. So we need to show, if you can show that people go to your database, use it and make informed decisions in countries, that it's really influencing on policies. We have a very strong argument. I think we need to go more to the data use. We eventually need to talk more about data literacy. We need to turn those data into good policies, but we need to enable people to do so. And we can't stop just saying and automatically assuming all this data will be wonderful used, right? So let me wrap it up, Henri-Bernard. So this is a wonderful database. It has a lot of interesting information. It should be populated widely. It comes at the right time. I think, it's just the beginning. We have to go far further, and we need to align and work together jointly to make this, that this is really turned into addressing the root causes and helping people get social protection and the ability for productive lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Johannes. Again, very concrete call for beefing up our work on statistics for the sake of better policy making. That's extremely useful. I have quite a few questions already in the Q&A section. There's one that was directed to Florence, but I guess she's been already taken care of. I have more questions on, let me ask it to all the panelists, just in case. It's Rutendo Matanga who says he's asking on whether the current pandemic may pose an opportunity for making governments adopt conditional social protection programs for unregistered economic units that are aimed at upscaling their business units while assisting them at household level to encourage registration. So for Florence, but also for Alex or for Francoise, do we have an opportunity here with the pandemic? Who would like to take that one? Florence, I think, has left us, unfortunately. Francoise, Alex, would you like to answer the question of Rutendo about whether the pandemic is an opportunity for governments to adopt conditional social protection programs?
I can maybe, try to an answer, and Francoise may wish also to complement. I don't like this word opportunities, because I think that the pandemic has been, affecting very badly, many people in the world, and so I'm not, very, keen to hear this word of opportunities, but definitely it has probably made greater awareness on the importance of extending social protection, especially to those informal economy workers that has not been covered. And I think that what the KIIbIH is, showing using the information at, based on also individuals and households, is the possibility also to detangle the poverty status of informal economy workers. And I imagine that definitely with this information, if it is monitored on a regular basis, this can become a very useful tool for policymakers, to try to, target those informal economy workers that live in poverty and provide them with some kind of cash transfers to lift them out of poverty. And for those who are actually not in poverty, I think that the options might be different. We're looking at the possibility also for some informal economy workers, maybe not the majority, but that lives in better off households also to, have the possibility maybe to contribute to social insurance schemes, as long as obviously there is an offer that fits the needs of this type of informal economy workers.
Françoise.
Yes. Well, what the pandemic has made clear is how essential informal workers are in most of the developing world. They were the providers of food, access to food, waste removal, transportation. They were all things that informal workers were key for. So they became visible, they became obvious as essential. So in that sense, that's why I think the question came in the form of, is it an opportunity? Mm-hmm. However, on the whole, in most countries, whatever relief program, emergency relief program was provided, informal workers did not have access to those. WIEGO has undertaken a study in 2 ways in 12 cities around the world, surveying informal workers, and in some countries there's just zero access to any emergency assistance. The occasional cash transfers, cash payments have occurred in some places, and those can be seen and possibly become something to build on for establishing some version of entitlement to some support. So the crisis has sort of made governments realize there's an enormous workforce there they count on for cities to work in particular and to operate and for people to have access to essentials. But the thing that we're seeing now and we're concerned about is that unfortunately, like the financial crisis, even though it's a different kind of crisis, there's now a fiscal pressure on governments, and this crisis is turning into fiscal crisis of the state. And so what that does and has done historically and is starting to do now is that the pandemic becomes a pretext for actually making life harder for informal workers. I mean, if you've been able to kick out street vendors from the best trading spots and the best central city market areas, you might keep it that way. And that's what some of what we're starting to hear from the field. So yes, I think on the issue of social protection has become much more visible. It certainly put social protection for informal workers on the global agenda and some national agendas, but there's also a lot of other greater risks now for informal workers.
Thank you very much, Francoise. There are also a lot of questions on the database that are asked in the Q&A, and some of them are being answered in writing. Some of them can also be answered after the meeting. But I have one for you, Justina, from Luis Calle Rosasco. He's from the National Statistics Office of Peru, and he says the following. He says, during the presentation, you, Justina, commented the use of household surveys for many countries to build the database. That's one, of course, of the key pillars of it. But however, in the Peruvian case, a panel household survey was noted. Does this difference respond to specific technical reasons? And he says, as far as I was informed by my colleagues, the Peruvian National Household Survey produces both panel and non-panel results in parallel.
Yes, so thank you so much for your question. We've privileged where we could the panel data that are available. So yes, we use the INEGI version that is the panel set, currently from 2011 to 2015, in order to track, like I mentioned earlier, the transitions in and out of informal employment, as well as in and out of poverty. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much. We have more on the database, and that one I think could be for you or for Alex. We have, unlike the cash transfer system as part of social protections measures, are there different other measures, especially for Africa? Are the data on informality, do they take account of COVID-19 effect on the informal sector? And could this data be useful for the evaluation of COVID-19's impact in those informal sectors? Alex, would you like to take this one?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, and obviously we see a lot of interest on, looking at the impact of COVID-19, especially on informal economic workers. So what I want to say is that the KIIbIH is a living database. We are really trying to update the KIIbIH with the latest data available as new data becomes available, and obviously to provide a sound and comparable analysis of the impact of the COVID, we will need to have more recent data. So at the moment, we don't have the latest data for, a large number of countries because, there's been also an issue of data collection, especially during the crisis. There has been some special ad hoc surveys that were conducted to try to provide rapid feedback on the impact of the COVID. But the purpose of the KIIbIH is really to work through standard household surveys with a good labor module. And at the moment, the answer is no, because we still don't have enough data, recent data, to really look at the impact of the COVID using the KIIbIH. But this is something that would be possible, in the coming, months or years, because again, we are really trying to produce recent indicators and have more countries with, time series data so that we can assess the impacts.
Thank you, Alexandre, and thank you to Hamoudat Mazou for asking the question. Another one, this time from Ali Khan in Pakistan, who says, we are on course to developing a labor registry for informal economy workers for their potential inclusion in social insurance schemes. How can a data set like KIIbIH inform the design of such a labor registry?
So
I guess again.
I've been trying to provide some of the answer. I guess that, you know, there's a number of useful information that are available in the KIIbIH, both individual and household level information. And depending on also on how you would like to use this labor registry for what purpose. But I think that you can really look at the database and see what of, you know, the information and the way the indicators are disaggregated that you believe you know, could be the most useful for you for your own exercise, depending on what exactly you will be trying to achieve, whether it's to improve the working conditions or whether it's actually to provide some kind of, you know, social protection to informal economy workers. And I think that, you know, looking at these type of indicators that are available in the KIIbIH, this can probably, you know, give you some ideas on, you know, what information you could potentially, you know, try to collect as part of this exercise that you're conducting.
Thank you, Alex. We have a question that I guess is pretty much for all participants, all panelists here, which is, what do you see as next steps for the database? Some of you, you know, touched upon this, but the question goes like this. Do you feel that the availability of information may be used to advocate changes within government policies, especially being more inclusive of informal workers? How do you foresee this taking place or playing out?
I'm happy also to take the question, but if others want also to respond to that, you know, I think that one way to try to answer to this question is really to look at the perspective of data users. We'd like very much to encourage use of the data by local researchers, by policy analysts, as a way also to conduct national diagnosis on, you know, the status and the vulnerability of informal economy workers. And these diagnoses, you know, could potentially be used for advocacy purpose and also to help, you know, guide some debate and policy discussions on the way to reduce vulnerabilities in the informal economy. So the way, you know, the potential of the KIIbIH in terms of, you know, how it can actually impact policy making processes, I would say, depends very much on the possibility for a large number of data users to really, you know, take the data, use the data, produce analysis, and we would be very happy actually also to, you know, to collect and gather the information that, you know, users can produce using the data. And at national level, you know, to use this information to really feed ongoing discussions on the way to tackle the vulnerability challenge in the informal economy. On our side, I mean, obviously, we are also doing research and policy work based on the data, often at sort of a more, you know, comparable level across countries. But we like very much to encourage, you know, a broad use, a large use of the data at national level.
Thank you very much. Edgar, would you like to come back on this?
Just to add to the comment of Alexandre, in the case of Mexico, we believe this the information that we are producing is very important because can show you the very key point of the problem in the informal sector in Mexico. It means most of the people who are in the informal sector in Mexico are persons who has a lower education, lower than 9 years old, for example. 9 years, sorry, of education. It means they have the very basic education in Mexico. But if you see to the people who are in the formal sector, they have more than 12 years of education. It's a very specific behavior that happened in Mexico. And the key point is the difference between education and more, because also in our country, we can show that most of the incomes who receive the household in Mexico is through the jobs, not, for example, the rent of capital. It means most of people in Mexico are subordinated to a job, for example. And this job demands a certain level of a skill. And if you don't have it, because your education is very low, you don't have the opportunity to incorporate to the formal activity. So why we know all of this? Because the survey, the studies, and all of this information show the situation that happened in Mexico. So the answer is yes, it's very important, and the very specific useful of the information is that you can understand very clear what is happening, and that the people who have to make the policy or are the policymaker have the opportunity to understand very clear. I know this is very difficult to change this kind of reality and principle when it depends of a very complex structure that is the education in the case principle in the case of Mexico. But at least we know the specific problematic that we are suffering in the case of the informal sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Edgar. This is Ruby Han asking these questions. Johannes, would you like to follow up on what the next steps are for the database?
No, first, the question is great. And I just built on the answer by Alexandre and Edgar. I mean, to reflect on how this turning good data into policy making and action is a little bit behind. And so based on more than 20 years of experience of Paris 21, where, as you said, Henri-Bernard, we have this bringing together data users and data producers, is to some extent a bit the one element of an answer. For instance, very concretely, what helps a lot is if you, for instance, if you have in specific countries you are interested in, as the development center, for instance, here as a team, to have a topical conversation where you bring in the policymakers and the advisors to the policymakers and the researchers and the statisticians, the data users and the data producers on a given topic. So inclusive recovery in Madagascar, the role of social protection for informal workers, something like this. You bring the database, you bring the data, you have a good conversation on the data, but also on the policy side. So it's really also helping our statistical colleagues and friends to and I think I can speak here with the benediction of the Statistical Commission and statistical. There is a lot of recognition in our own field that eventually over the last decades there has been too much focus on data production itself and to put out the data, but not enough on data use, uptake, visualization, data engagement, data journalism, and those kind of things. So I think you need to help the colleagues in the statistical institutes to go that extra mile, because you understand what the policymakers want. And here, if you can be intermediaries, I believe it's called, helping turning, that could be something where you want to look at, and just put out one or two compelling examples for one or two countries. That could already go quite a bit. Thanks.
Thank you, Johannes. We have a new acronym and a new word, intermediary. That's a good crop. I have a question for pretty much all of you, but I see that Francoise, you raised your hand. Did you want to react to any of those discussions?
Yes, just one point about sort of the visibility and the importance. What and the use of statistics in sort of those policy discussions at the national level is that we tend to think that it's very important to draw attention to the vulnerabilities and the need for policy action there. But it's also important to draw attention to the contributions that the informal economy makes to the whole operation of a city, for example, or at the national level. The enormous share of employment in many countries that is informal. And that, as you said, as the OECD has already said, informal is normal. that the contribution both as individual workers, but contribution as economic units to what's going on, to what's going on. So it's sort of, I always hesitate when only vulnerability is emphasized without emphasizing the other side, that these economies would not run the way they run right now. Formal sector firms would not have customers, and you know, the integral part of the economy. So I just wanted to say that for balance, it's important to have both of these pieces together. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Francoise. I have a question from Tant Coco for all panelists, saying this might be slightly off topic, and I don't think it is, but do the panelists think it might be possible or important to incorporate other closely linked issues such as child labor, specifically the worst forms of child labor, which typically take place in the informal economy? Any taker for how we can include child labor issues in these surveys? Edgar.
Yes, in the case of Mexico, in fact, we measured this 2 years ago. And every 2 years, we are measuring the child labor sector, because for us is very important. The context of Mexico is that it's going down from the last 10 years that we started to measure this, from more than 3 million of child in this situation to now 2 million. The behavior is going down. We are approaching to a kind of amount that is really difficult to disappear, because these are in the rural area principle. In principle, this is the reason that is so difficult, is in far and difficult access to the urban areas, in mountain and something like that. This is the reason why the more than 1 million that the reduced was in the big cities, but the other part of the amount belong to difficult areas to mention. But yes, we are in all of this information adding not only to measure the traditional workers and the informal sector, but also the child labor sector, because at the end, by definition, is part of all this picture of informality. So we have information. If someone wants to know the experience of Mexico in this specific area, we have a lot of measuring and experience applying the specific surveys about that. So we will be in the possibility to advise anyone who want to know about this indicator. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Edgar, for a very concrete example. Let me ask a final question in a few minutes that we have left, and I think it's pretty much pointed at Johannes from Daniela Benjamin, but others may want to respond. It's also, would it be possible or useful to gather more data on the impact of policy measures that are adopted by different countries to tackle informality? One thing is to study informality, and the other thing is to say, are policies working? What do you think? Any takers, Johannes, Alex?
Want to answer the question? Yeah, I think that this is a very critical question. As we try to really to build some time series in the KIIbIH, these are typically the type of question that we could potentially try to answer. So taking at particular policy reforms or measures, and as we are able to monitor over time, changes on informal economy workers, on vulnerabilities, and also on the contribution. I think that this is a very important point that Francoise made, that it's true that it's also very important to look at the contribution that informal economy workers make to society. But for that, we need to have really, I think, information over time to try to address this type of, more evaluation questions.
If I can follow up, I mean,
please.
This is a methodological a super duper question and not easy. I mean, assessing those kind of policies in terms of impact of, you would have to control for a lot of things. You would eventually have to do RCTs and those kind of things. So for the purpose of applied research for policy making, I mean, for researchers, wonderful, very, very important and good. For a little bit more applied, I would possibly go more for something what the OECD stands for is peer review learning and bringing together different stakeholders, testing out where policymakers can share policy experiences with these type of policies and to compare, doing light touch stakeholder interviews. I mean, first assessment of policies to have a good conversation of what kind of policies worked in which kind of context and to have an open debate. And mechanistically saying this policy is good and this policy is bad on simple indicators is just not doing justice to the complexity of the issue, not speaking about of any endogeneity problems, heterogeneity problems, any other econometric problems that we don't want to talk here about. So my advice would be to go for very important question, but break it down to something that policymakers can deal with, and what the center here and ILO and others who are not in the first place research organizations, but policy advisory organizations can really do. That would be my advice. Thanks.
Thank you, Johannes. That's taking us to the end of our session. So I'd like to thank all of you participants for being with us. Thank our panelists also for playing the game. And of course, our partner, socialprotection.org, and Carre for putting this together. Congratulations in such a nice way. As Alex and Justina have said, there's going to be some follow-up on this. We with socialprotection.org are going to make the PowerPoints and the documentation and the links available to you all. There's on our webpage for KIIbIH, there is also an email address for any questions you may have. And let me just recall that this is the beginning of a journey, and we really want to hear from you on how useful the database is, on the papers that you may write thanks to it, which we'll be happy to circulate and to give visibility to, and on any suggestions, feedback you have on how to make this better, more accessible, more comprehensive, any suggestions you have also for working with us on this. So thank you, everyone. Have a very good afternoon, and we're looking forward to continuing the discussion with you.
Thank you so much.